Hey Tom's Hardware viewers, I'm Jared Walton and I'm here today with the review of the GeForce RTX 3050. This is the EVGA XC Black card. Also, we have the Zotac RTX 3050 Twin Edge OC. Of note, the overclocked edition comes with a 1.7% increase in boost clock, 1807 MHz instead of 1777 MHz. It costs 60% more as MSRP. Meanwhile, the XC Black has an MSRP of $249.99, so $250. I'm just going to drop the 99 cents business. The XC Gaming version has an 1845 MHz boost clock, and it has an MSRP of $330. Now, neither of these cards are selling at anywhere close to their MSRPs because the GPU market is all kinds of screwed up, but let's just stick with that for a minute. The reference clock cards, as far as we can tell, Nvidia is basically requiring their partners to sell them at the $250 MSRP. Once it's a factory overclocked card, then all bets are off. The XC Gaming is the cheapest we've seen advertised at a starting price of $330. We've also seen the Asus ROG Strix 3050 advertised for $480. That's quite the spread, needless to say. Almost double the price for probably 3 fans, some extra RGB bling, and, it gives you a nice overclock, but you're not going to take the 3050 and turn it into a 3060. Extra heat pipes. The 3060 has like 50% more memory. It's got 50% more memory bandwidth. Actually, more than that because it's 15 gigabits per second memory instead of 14 gigabits. And it's got more shader cores and all that stuff. Basically, it's not 50% faster, but it's around 30 to 50% faster depending on the game and settings. And there's no way you're going to match a 3060 with an overclocked 3050. Like, you couldn't overclock the 3050 enough unless, maybe liquid nitrogen. All right, got a lot to cover. The good news, 3050 is the cheapest RTX card we've ever had, officially priced anyway. Bad news, retail pricing is going to more likely land in the $400 to $500 range. And that's because, the cap is going to be cards like the RTX 2060 and let me show you. The RTX 2060 Founders Edition. We've also got the RX 5600 XT. Those are selling for like $500. Along with that, you've also got the XFX RX 6600, which sells for $500 to $525 on eBay. So those are kind of the price cap that we're going to see for the RTX 3050 cards. They're slower than these $500 cards, or cards that sell for $500. Which means that, no one should pay $500 for the slower RTX 3050. Let's go through some of the other cards we'll be testing for comparison today. XFX Radeon RX 6500 XT. You can see it's only got the 2 video outputs. We've also got the super old GTX 1060 6GB, and from the AMD side, this is an MSI RX 570 4GB card. No backplate on that one. Those are both like 5 years old, I want to say. And we've also got the in-between generations. So from the AMD camp, we've got 8GB and 4GB RX 5500 XT cards. That's the card that the RX 6500 is supposed to replace. In practice, the 5500 XT is often faster, even with 4GB, and it's definitely faster with 8GB. We've also got GTX 1660 Super. This is going to be a pretty close match for the RX 3050, except the 3050 has more memory and it has RTX and DLSS, meaning it can do ray tracing as well as DLSS support. And then we've got GTX 1650 Super, and last but not least, we have the regular gigabyte version of the GTX 1650. But how much faster is a 3050 than the competition? And more importantly, how does it look compared to the RTX 2060, the card that came before it? Now I've upgraded my test system for GPUs. You can see it back here. This is a Cooler Master half 500 case. It's got a Cooler Master power supply, and it's got a Core i9 12900K processor, liquid cooled, and it also has an MSI Z690A Pro DDR4 Wi-Fi motherboard. It's DDR4 because DDR5 is one of the few components that is giving graphics cards a run for the money in terms of being horrendously overpriced. Beyond that, we've got a 2 terabyte Crucial P5 Plus SSD storing all the games in the operating system. So pretty much as state-of-the-art as you can get. PCI Express 4.0 support, which will benefit cards like the RTX 3050 and even AMD's RX 6500 XT, which only has 4 lanes of PCI connectivity, PCI Express connectivity, and that's kind of a problem because if you pair it with an older PCI Express 3.0 system, we measured performance losses of anywhere from 8% on average to 25% in some games. Okay, let's hit our games. We're going to start with 1080p medium to high settings, and we've got a suite of 7 games. These are relatively modern and often quite demanding games, and so this is more of a look at worst case level of performance, which is what I like to see. I mean, if you want to know if the cards can run CSGO or League of Legends, yes, everything can run those games at 1080p medium settings and more than 60 frames per second, including Intel's integrated graphics, at least their recent stuff. But I want to see kind of the worst case. So overall, the EVGA reference clocked 3050 averaged 98 frames per second across our test suite, while Zotac's amazingly ambitious factory overclock increased performance by, almost nothing. It's barely faster at 1080p medium because Nvidia cards often run above their boost clock, and that's what we see here. So that despite the 30 megahertz advantage that the Zotac card theoretically has, in practice, it made no difference. We can also see that relative to the competition, the 3050 was 26% faster than the RX 6500 XT, 69% faster than the GTX 1650. It sort of kind of replaces. It's also about 25% faster than the GTX 1650 Super, 6% faster than the GTX 1660 Super, and that's also basically equivalent to the 1660 Ti in performance. That's the good news. Bad news is that the RTX 2060 Founders Edition, so reference clock 2060, was 9% faster, and that card came out at the start of 2019, 3 years ago. So in that time, Nvidia has managed to drop the price about 30% for 9% less performance. Not terrible, but not great either. 5600 XT was also 18% faster, while the newer 3060 was 33% faster, and AMD's RX 6600 was 41% faster overall. That's not including ray tracing performance or DLSS, but plenty of games don't support either of those technologies, so this is a good baseline look at how the GPUs stack up. Flipping through the individual results, Borderlands 3 basically follows our overall rankings, and the only real difference is that the spread got a bit larger because even at medium settings, it can use more than 4 gigabytes of VRAM. Far Cry 6, meanwhile, without the HD texture pack, it follows our overall placement, and some of the Nvidia cards maybe improve a bit, but it's pretty comparable to the overall standings. Flight Simulator swaps things around a bit at the top, with the 3060 now coming in ahead of the 6600, and the 2060 leads the 5600 XT, but the 3050 cards both still land in 5th and 6th place overall. Forza Horizon 5 goes the other way, with the RX 6600 now easily taking the pole position, likely thanks to its 32 megabyte Infinity cache, though the rest of the results are similar to what we've seen elsewhere. Horizon Zero Dawn puts the 3060 back on top, but the 5600 XT easily beats the RTX 2060, which in turn still holds a slight advantage over the RTX 3050 cards. Red Dead Redemption 2 is our sole game using the Vulkan API, though that doesn't really change the standings much. The 2060 does come out just ahead of the 5600 XT, but both remain ahead of the 3050 newcomers. Also note that you can see here how DLSS does help performance in Red Dead Redemption 2 if you enable it. Same on Horizon Zero Dawn. We only tested the 3050 with DLSS because we wanted to otherwise show apples to apples performance comparisons, so DLSS was not factored into the overall standings. Finally, Watch Dogs Legion isn't particularly demanding at medium settings. You can see most of the GPUs manage 60 frames per second or more, with the RX 6600 coming out on top, and the 3050 cards coming in once again just behind the 2060. We haven't said much about some of the older GPUs, but let's go back to the overall standings. The GTX 1650 ranks as the slowest GPU we tested, followed by the RX 570 4GB and the GTX 1060 6GB. Then we get a cluster of 3 cards that are all basically tied: the 1650 Super, the 6500 XT, and the 5500 XT 4GB, which are all slower than the RX 5500 XT 8GB. So AMD took a step backward in the budget performance realm, while the RTX 3050 lands just a touch ahead of the GTX 1660 Super. Basically, the 3050 gives you similar performance to the GTX 1660 Super, but now you have the option to enable ray tracing and DLSS in games that support it. You also get 2 GB more memory, and it's all at a theoretically similar price point. 1660 Super incidentally currently sells on eBay for a bit under $500, so again, that's kind of where in the present market we expect the RTX 3050 to land. Moving on to 1080p Ultra testing, this will bump up the VRAM requirements, but the only real change in rankings is with the 6500 XT and 1650 Super that swap places, and that's probably in part thanks to Nvidia's card having 16 PCI Express lanes compared to only 4 lanes on the 6500 XT, though the AMD card does get the benefit of that PCI Express 4.0 connection. The RX 6600 and RTX 3060 are also basically tied now, where the AMD card had more of a lead at 1080p medium. None of the other standings changed, so even though the RTX 3050 has 8GB of memory, it's not able to overtake the 6GB 2060 or 5600 XT cards. It performs respectably considering the 128-bit memory interface, and lands ahead of the 1660 Super, while the cards with 4GB of memory take more of a hit to performance, and the 5500 XT with 8GB now beats the 4GB variant by 20%. In the individual game charts, Borderlands 3 at badass settings favors AMD's GPUs, which is no real surprise since this is an AMD promoted game and has always favored AMD GPUs. Far Cry 6 is another AMD promoted game, though it mostly matches our overall rankings. As before, the 3050 continues to land between the 1660 Super and RTX 2060 in performance. Flight Simulator again mixes things up quite a bit at the top of the chart, but the 3050 position remains the same. 8GB of memory doesn't seem to matter as much here, considering the 2 nearly identical 5500 XT results. But there are other factors, like if you're playing the game over a longer period of time, you probably do experience more stuttering on the cards with less memory. Forza Horizon 5, at its extreme preset, ends up being one of the most demanding games in terms of VRAM, and it's one of the few instances where the 3050 ranks ahead of the 2060. The 4GB cards likewise suffer quite a bit here and clump together at the bottom of the chart. Horizon Zero Dawn mostly follows the overall average, but the 3060 is again at the top, just ahead of the 6600, and this is technically an AMD promoted game, though it did add support for DLSS more recently, and you can see how that helps performance a bit. It's basically become more of a GPU agnostic game in our book. Red Dead Redemption 2, also theoretically GPU agnostic, though it added DLSS support about a year after launch. We have the DLSS results for the 3050 in the charts. You can see it doesn't help a ton, but gives you maybe 10% more performance. And the Nvidia GPUs overall have a strong showing at 1080p Ultra. Last but not least, Watch Dogs Legion is the sole Nvidia promoted game in our standard benchmark list, and at Ultra settings it can even use more than 8GB of VRAM. This is one more instance where the 3050 just barely edges past the RTX 2060. Our full article on tomshardware.com has additional testing at 1440p Ultra and also has 1080p Ultra with ray tracing enabled, but we're going to skip that for the video review. We're going to focus instead just on the 1080p results. And with ray tracing now, we're going to look at 1080p with medium settings. Now, of note, while there are games that are AMD promoted that have ray tracing, most of those only use ray traced shadows like Godfall, Riftbreaker, Dirt 5, World of Warcraft, Deathloop and Far Cry 6. I think they use ray tracing reflections as well, but they're hybrid reflections, so they combine screen space reflections with ray traced reflections. Basically, it's all in pursuit of lowering the performance hit of ray tracing, but also it lowers the quality of the ray tracing effects. So none of those really do a lot with the ray tracing effects, and we're skipping them and instead focusing on 6 games that we've selected that all use multiple ray tracing effects, where it's obvious when you're looking at the images whether ray tracing is enabled or disabled. Whether that's good or bad, we'll leave that up to you. Given Nvidia really kicked off ray tracing push with the RTX 20 series in 2018, 3 years ahead of AMD, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise that the RTX GPUs easily eclipse their AMD counterparts. The 3050 averaged 39 frames per second across our test suite at medium with medium ray tracing settings, compared to 37 frames per second for AMD's otherwise faster RX 6600. And at the bottom of the charts, you can see the RX 6500 XT averaging just 7.4 frames per second with ray tracing. Now, part of that is because the 6500 XT wouldn't even let us try to run Control with ray tracing enabled, probably because of 4 gigabytes of memory. And then in Fortnite, we couldn't use the medium settings. It immediately caused the game to crash. The 6600 also kept crashing in Fortnite, but we did at least manage to get some results. Overall, though, ray tracing still remains a better option if you're using an Nvidia GPU. RTX 3050, if you enable DLSS, even in the highest quality DLSS quality mode, that bumps performance up by more than 60% overall, giving frame rates of more than 60 FPS in most of the games. We do have one game that supports AMD's Fidelity FX Super Resolution upscaling, that's Cyberpunk 2077. But FSR isn't really the same as DLSS. It's not AI enhanced, it's just kind of a general algorithm. And Nvidia has its Nvidia image scaling that kind of does a similar thing. We've decided not to test those because mostly you just get scaling that's similar to what you see without DLSS or FSR. Going through the individual results quickly, Bright Memory Infinite, the 3050 cards rank just ahead of the 6600, but the 2060 and 3060 are both faster. DLSS gives a nice boost to performance there. Definitely required if you want to play this game with ray tracing at any reasonable resolution. Control, we're using Control Ultimate Edition. We've used medium ray tracing and overall settings, and the standings basically don't change too much. It's a bit higher frame rates than we see in some of the other games, even though it does have lots of reflections and ambient occlusion and lighting effects, but it runs quite well, especially if you turn on DLSS. Cyberpunk 2077, one of the big disappointments for 2020, arguably. You can see that without DLSS, a bunch of the cards fall below 30 frames per second. This is at medium settings with medium ray tracing. So we do have the shadows and the global illumination and the reflections enabled, but everything else is at like medium textures, medium everything else. DLSS does bump up performance a lot here. Gives you 46 frames per second on the 3050. The 3060 did clear 30 frames per second without DLSS, so you can definitely get into the 50 plus range on that card with DLSS, and probably more if you want to use one of the bigger upscaling factors. Fortnite, we've got medium settings on all the RT effects, which means, that's still a lot of RT. We still get over 30 frames per second average on the lower end of the spectrum with the 3050 and the 6600, while the 2060 Had slower minimum frame rates, possibly because of 6 gigabytes of memory, but higher average frame rates. And then we got the 3060 and the 3050 with DLSS topping the charts. Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition. So this one requires ray tracing hardware to run, unlike the original release. 3060 even beats the 3050 with DLSS, while the 2060 comes next. And then 6600, this is one of the rare instances with a complex ray tracing game where AMD's 6600 managed to lead the RTX 3050 by a bit. This is at the high setting with medium shaders specified, so not as demanding as it can get. And then finally, last, we have Minecraft. This is with full path tracing. Like, you don't get any other options. It's either all on or all off, and it, Minecraft runs on a potato if you want it to. But with ray tracing, even with DLSS, we're barely getting 60 frames per second average on the 3050. You can see the RX 6600 got just 25 frames per second, and the 6500 XT did manage to struggle along at about 14 frames per second, whereas the RTX 3050 got 36 frames per second. So there you have it. EVGA 3050, Zotac 3050, both tested, both virtually identical performance, also virtually identical features. 3 display ports, 1 HDMI 2.1 port, dual slot, dual fan. They're so similar. They require a single 8-pin power connector, which is more than sufficient since the cards use about 130 watts maximum. In our testing, I think they were closer to 120 in most games, maybe 135 watts in something like Furmark. Compared to AMD's RX 6500 XT, I mean, on paper, it's a landslide victory for the RTX 3050. It's about 30% faster at 1080p medium, and it's up to 60-70% faster at 1080p ultra, and even double the performance if you push settings in some of the games. But, that's not settings you would even try running on the 6500 XT. The catch is, it does cost 20% more theoretical MSRP. What's the actual real world pricing going to be? And that's tough to say. Bitcoin and Ethereum and mining profitability as a whole have been dropping of late. Thank goodness, right? So hopefully that trend continues, and we might actually get 3050 cards for under $350. That's probably going to take a few months still, but that's what we're hoping for. Again, you can check out our full review on tomshardware.com, where we have additional details on the testing, additional results for power and noise and fan speed testing, clock speeds. But all of those things just factor back into performance, and you can see where the performance lands in here. Hope you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.